Video005. We've been plowing through these. It's really cool. This one, we're getting into the fluids. I've been kind of teasing about this because I'm excited about it. It's going to be just really fun to get to use Max 2018's new fluid system and also do a lot of really cool stuff. Now, as we are at the end of the year and we're creeping to 2018, again, I just want to check in, see how you're doing. I've gotten a massive response from everyone about all the training so far and also about the last video too. So I know I had a bit of a long outro, I guess, but yeah, the information I shared, I mean, I thought that was really critical to share a bit of insight into a lot of studios and how they think, what they look for and what are considered strengths. So if you haven't watched the last video at the end of it, I just kind of wanted to discuss a little bit about that because I think it is really vital for all of us. That being said, this video, like I said, we're going to do all the fluids. We're going to be doing a lot of cool stuff. After that, we're going to be getting into bringing it all together. So video 6, we're going to be doing the rendering, the lighting, breaking up all the elements, really tweaking the shaders and the look of it all. And I usually leave that till last because for me, it's always a race. I want to get all the effects done, and then I can focus on making it all look good. Okay, and I think that lighting and shaders are so important, almost as important as all the other aspects that we've been doing. So I think it's going to be pretty awesome to get through. As I mentioned, I think it was like the second video, but if you haven't had a chance to share the stuff, like I said, I want this to benefit everyone. And maybe now that you've been going through it and hopefully seeing how much I've been killing myself trying to get all this done and get it all to you, literally canceled my plans for Christmas to finish this stuff up. So yeah, it's been insane. But I'm hoping that if you have a moment, feel free to share this. Like I said, it would mean the world to me if you can get that speakerphone out and yell out to the mountains about this stuff. Just because, again, I think we're all in this together, and I want us all rise up together. So that being said, I'm going to get in this video. If you do want to share, click the button below. Don't worry, I won't mention it again. But I thought that, I do stand by this. I think this is really great what we're doing, and I want to keep it going. All right, so that's it for now. Let's dive into this video. Okay, so it's time. Let's get into some liquid. Now, let's go to effects. I'm just going to create a new layer. We'll call this liquid, just so it's in its own layer. Drop it into effects, make that current. All right, so if you do not have update 3 for 2018 installed yet, you're going to need to do that. So that way you can see fluids down here. And I've already talked about it, so I'll give it an introduction. I'm just going to drop this node in. And just explain as we go, this is the emitter icon. So by default, the icon both works as a system and an emitter. So if we wanted just to start out, we could just aim this downward. And that way the droplets are all aiming down. That means it's going to go down. If we go to the modify panel, this is just called liquid. We have like a sphere, box, plane, custom. You can show the voxel grid, which I'll get into in a moment, as well as the icon. So those are the basic settings. Everything pretty much shows up in simulation view. When I click that, we can see that voxel grid that it's referring to, and the icon, of course, is this thing here. And this is the basic Max Fluids interface. So the big difference between Naiad and Bifrost and this, Bifrost and Naiad are both node-based, whereas with this is more linear. And I don't have much to, I can't really comment on the future of it. I haven't been involved in the development of this, but I would imagine that it is eventually going to go node-based. I do personally feel like the fact that it's fitting into update 3, it's more kind of like, let's just get it out there as quick as we can, and then, Max 2019, I'm sure, is going to have like a much more implemented version of this. So the solver itself is rock solid. So its capability is great. It's just in terms of the linear interface, it's a bit kind of like comparing Nuke and After Effects. It's very linear in that sense. So that being said, I do have a lot of faith that this will improve over time, but that's not to say that it isn't already really powerful and really amazing. It's just there are going to be some limitations with it. Okay, so to just start out, let's just say that we're working with a sphere. I don't want to give like an introduction to this. I will put out training on this at some point. But let's just do a few things. While we're in Liquid, I might switch to effects controls, and let's just create a flat plane. And it has to be a plane, which we can use as a kill shape. So we can basically say anything that goes out of camera frame, the particles then die. So we have in the liquid attributes, the file left here, because we have liquid, solver, caching, display, render. So liquid attributes are more the inputs. So here I can choose add kill plane and add this thing in here. And it means that any liquids that come in contact with it will die out. Okay, so pretty important. The other one is collisions. So if we wanted, we could actually get this guy here, add him in, and that's going to be a collision object. All right. So right now I just added the character as a collision. We have the plane as the kill plane, so anything that goes below here will die. And from there I can start running the simulation. What I prefer to do is let's just go to caching really quick, and it has where you want to save it out to. By default you could leave it as the default. And the thing is, I'm pretty careful to know where my caches are going for two reasons. One is so that way I know they're going to be in a place that has a lot of disk space, because anything similar to this, any fluids that are caching out, they're going to have a lot of data being saved out. And on top of that, it's good to know where they're going to, so you can delete them later because they take up a lot of space. So just in general, I could turn this off and choose a network path if I wanted to. Just as a heads up, and this is kind of why I wanted to mention it, I found if I were to say like my network, it's going to have, at least in my experience, it doesn't really like having absolute network paths. So you're better off mapping a drive. So like, for instance, if I have a fluids caching drive, I might map it to Z drive, for instance. So for instance, I just created a drive folder here, which is pretty easy to do. Just use Google if you're unsure how to do it. And I'm just going to say in this case, just make it decay. I'll call it sim001. Okay, so it's going to create folders inside of there depending on what variables you put in here. So they're called tokens, but basically you've got an option of different inputs. So you can get rid of all of this if you want, and you could just have insert object name. Okay, and that's all you would need to do. So that's going to save it out there, so keep that in mind. Now, like I said, these are more inputs, so we just added a collision, we got a kill plane, I set up a path just so I know where it's going to, and then from there I could run sim. It's pretty straightforward in that sense. So by default, this is the emitter object it's going to use. The other thing that I'll just mention is this voxel grid. So this voxel grid is pretty detailed right now, just for our base sim. So I'm just going to quickly go into master voxel and set this to like 2 or 1.5 just to start out, okay? But let's just hit the play button, and that's going to run the sim, and the sim's going to start here. It's going to be a little slow because we're dealing with the geometry of this character, which is kind of complex. It's also deforming, okay? But you can see the progress, and that's the good thing too, is that as I sit here, the simulation's going to be happening in the viewport, and I can still move around and do whatever I want while I'm in here. Okay, so that cached pretty quickly, and here we can see the results. So right away, obviously it doesn't look too attractive. We can go to display and just change the size down to 0.1. That's something a bit more attractive to look at. And basically this is what the sim looks like. Now one thing I will point out just really quickly is that obviously it's a scale dependent, and our resolution, this guy isn't very big. We're in centimeters. So if I were to go and get my tape and just drag this down, it's about 92 centimeters, so that's about 3 feet. And that's, I'd say, this is like the top of his thigh about here, just below his waistline, his hip. and obviously he's slashed as well. So we are building everything to scale, but keep in mind that the fluid is moving fairly quick, and we probably want to stylize this a little bit more, make it more visible. Having it act too much like running water, falling really quickly, is not that interesting. So by default, the stats we're throwing in here, it's trying to emulate roughly what you're going to get with water, but obviously we want to stylize it more than that. So I just want to point that out. That's moving kind of quickly, but 0.1 display size is going to make it, at least that way we can visualize everything, get an idea of what's going on. Like I said, I'm not going to go through like an in-depth tutorial on fluids, but I am going to go through and explain to a degree like how to modify things, how to get the results we're after. So I'm going to do a quick preview of this just so we can see this in context. And just playing through a quick preview of this, we can kind of get an idea of like what's going on. Don't look so much at the particles as more as the shape it's forming, because keep in mind that these are not particles that we're looking at. We're looking at a level set. So we're looking at a rough shape of what would eventually become the fluid. So it's important to not look as much at individual particles with a setup like this. But just looking through it, kind of quickly, I definitely want to stylize it. I want it to fall quicker. There's a lot of stuff. So right now, we're just emitting some fluid. Let's even get this and move it a bit more into frame and set the radius smaller. Obviously, we're not going to emit liquid pour in this dude's head. We're going to do something a bit more interesting than that. But to start out with, just while we discuss this, I figure it might be worthwhile just kind of mentioning some of the controls. So icon size doesn't do anything, it's just display. Radius does control the display. It does control the radius of what it emits out of. Okay, so like I mentioned, this collides, this kills. Solver is where all the magic happens. So first of all, while we're in here, the voxel size, just like Fume Effects, the smaller it is, the more voxels fit in, so the more it revises it. So, I'm looking at the voxel size to kind of get a general idea of the shape, wherever it's hiding. There it is. So, yeah, that's pretty tiny, but I mean, you obviously can adjust this to kind of get different results. Making it bigger, you get a general idea of like if this was the environment, then how much space it's taking up. But basically, the lower it is, the more you're going to be able to fit in. Okay, so I'll keep it at 1.5 for now. It's just a good starting point. I want to affect the gravity. I'm going to make it slow down quite a lot. So right now it's at 4.5, which is a little under half because it's 9.8 meters per second. So by default, in most packages, 9.8 will be what you'll start with, unless it's some arbitrary number. And then we have just time steps, transport steps, voxel scaling. So transport steps is essentially kind of like Fume's CFL condition. Essentially, it's going to be how much distance is traveled in between each voxel to establish whether it needs to do sub steps. Okay, so in other words, if you wanted to do additional sub steps in here, then you can control the threshold as to how sensitive it is. Okay, whereas adaptivity, same deal. This is the actual sub steps per frame. Okay. And then in here we just get into voxel scaling and everything else. So these are more global, how do I put it, it's like multipliers essentially. So we probably won't get into much of this other than I'm going to put this up to about, a good starting point might be like around 8. We might tweak these two a little bit. We're definitely not going to get into voxel scaling at all. We'll definitely be playing with these two a bit. You can do motion fields, have custom gravity, all that kind of stuff. We're not going to worry about that stuff right now. System scale, that can be handy to fake your scale. So let's just say that you're working at a scale that isn't accurate. Let's say like you're working at a 1/10 the scale or a 1,000th the scale, something like that. Or you just want your effect to react at a different scale altogether. So you've got a lot of control in here, just stuff that might be taken for granted, but it's good to have it in there for when you need it. But just in general, we will go over some of the stuff later as we get into it. But the main things that I want to get into right now are going to be your liquid parameters. For the most part, I just want to up the viscosity a little bit, and that way we'll get more viscous fluid altogether, I mean. And we'll get into some of this stuff later. Most of this we're not going to change. The surface properties are definitely a big factor here. So density, really critical. The higher the density, the more heavier and thicker it's going to feel. Not to be confused with viscosity, which will make it have elasticity. Well, obviously just more viscosity, more viscous, but the density is going to make it heavier overall. By default, it escapes me off the top of my head, but 1,000 is basically the default for water. Okay, and I'm going back to like my real flow days, trying to remember density is one of those things I take for granted now, but essentially that's more of a universal value that's measured. I just can't remember what the specific thing it's valued, or sorry, measured from. But basically 1,000 is the density property. However, most of this will keep the same for now, but definitely just upping the density is important. If you have multiple objects, you can go in here and essentially override any properties, things like that. We don't have any custom objects in here right now, but later on, if you wanted to, you could affect them on an individual level, which a lot of the time you're probably going to need to do. The collision objects are really critical because this is how everything's treated. So for instance, looking at the collision object here, you've got thickness, and thickness essentially is like putting a shell modifier on this. It's essentially creating a layer around it for the collisions. Now why that's important is that the higher the thickness, the more range in between here and here that it has to calculate a collision. So if it's ultra thin, there's more likelihood that a particle is going to sample before and then after a collision and miss it. And then in return, you're going to need to up your sub-steps to sample more times in between each frame to be able to catch that collision. So to save a lot of time calculating your fluids, upping the thickness is going to allow for that. The thing is, obviously, a high thickness value means that a collision could get caught, up here or something. So it's probably easier just to explain this really quick. So if that was the thickness, let's say that's a thickness of 2.0, the particle is going to come down, and whether it samples here, 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 this is the thickness value, so it's going to catch it, and then it's going to deflect it off. Whereas if the thickness value is like 0.1, then it's not going to have much range, so the particle might sample and then miss it and continue going down. Okay, so just important to keep in mind. Obviously, doing things like solid, that's going to tell it that the particle can't go inside typically, so that's definitely going to be a safety guard as well. However, what was I going to say? Yeah, obviously the higher the thickness, if that was like 5, then your liquids are all going to be bouncing off like this, and it's going to look weird. Okay, so thickness is important though, because obviously if it was thin and it needs to sample in there and the particles are sampling like this, it's going to miss it. So doing all those sub steps means it'll catch it. So you got to up your sub steps, and that's going to slow things down. So higher the thickness is better because it's going to catch things a lot more. However, obviously you're going to have that visible collision here, which is going to look weird. So there was something else I was going to mention about this, but I can't remember off the top of my head. But yeah, basically, I in this case want to keep my thickness pretty low. We'll make it like 0.5, and that way it's going to be fairly tight, but it'll be enough room that we'll get liquids to pour and roll over everything, but still hug the geometry fairly closely. Okay, So then you got stuff like coarse interior and you got solid robust. We're not going to do these, but I just figured I'd mention these really quick. In fact, I guess we could use these here. I mean, basically solid is going to treat it like a solid object, so it's not going to allow particles to go inside of it, whereas shell is going to treat it like, you know, essentially like the polygons are doing. It's going to try and catch it, but things can go through. Robust basically is a really crude way of doing it, because what happens underneath is everything is a level set. So everything essentially is voxels, and that's why you got your voxel grid, and you can either have like not many, or you know, when you picture like image resolution, you're not going to get much of an image there, but the finer it is, the more you can begin to draw more accurate models from everything, okay, and get more accuracy. So same deal with this head collision. Technically what it's doing is it's subdividing it down, and it's trying to create a mesh around it. And so by doing this, it can say that's geo, that's geo, you know, and it's trying to draw that mesh, okay? And by doing coarsen, it's going to give a more crude rasterization, I guess. That might be the wrong term for it, but essentially rasterization to that level set. The level set won't be as defined as it breaks it down for the geometry. So this is just a way that you can tell it to be a bit more sloppy with its generation, but you know, give us a rough model, but not have to make it ultra refined. And again, these are just things that help speed it up depending on what you're doing. I wouldn't recommend it for any concave shapes or things like that, but something like this, which is capped, you know, it's still I wouldn't necessarily call that, I guess is how you look at it. Technically this is a concave shape, but in general it's more convex in terms of where we're trying to get stuff. And if I really wanted to, I could get really a bit more careful with my mesh here. I could probably generate a really basic proxy mesh and use the skin wrap to allow this character to animate and deform it, and use that and get, like, you know, much faster sims altogether. But I've tried to keep this fairly clean, and you know, it'll do the job. But yeah, so for the most part, like, thickness is the only thing I'm dropping down there. But I wanted to mention this stuff, and I might as well keep these on, and it'd be good just to kind of see whether we get any errors or anything like that, or whether it kind of manages to still accurately create collisions for the cheek and things like that are a bit more, we're being a bit more careful about. And obviously we could go into doing, if you did overrides, you could do individual properties for this, so that way if you want to set up additional velocities for this object but not for another one, or whatever you want to do, you've got a lot of controls there. Kill plane, bit of a no-brainer. Guide system, I've never really gotten, like, dived into this stuff too much. I will say in Max Fluids, which is, it literally has just come out at the time of making this lesson, I have not done any large-scale sims with it. I'm very experienced in Naiad, semi-experienced in Bifrost, but Max Fluids I'm pretty much brand new to, but it's still all the same system, it's all the same process. So I mean, learning Bifrost, you're gonna, you know all the technical terms and everything else here as well, and the process as well. It's just, interface-wise, it's a bit more rudimentary. But that's the basic stuff, is you get your simulation and your liquids, and then from here it's just more individual properties for your emitter object, collision objects. Right now we're not using any emitter objects, so it's just the simple little sphere that we have here, but we will be getting into that in a moment. So going back into Solver, I might just lower this to 2. It's going to be a lot slower to fall, but I kind of want this to feel more oily, murky. I'm not going for like a realistic water simulation. I'm not trying to do that. What I'm trying to get is more a simulation of kind of like, yeah, just this kind of pussy stuff coming out of everywhere and doing its thing. So I'm going to run a sim again. Just all I did is lower the gravity, bring in the shell a little bit, which doesn't really matter. Substeps, which, you know, none of that's really going to be too noticeable. It's more just like looking at the speed right now to kind of get an idea of how it's going to look. Okay, so I ran a quick sim here. One thing that I did do, I actually turned off the robust version. It is for this particular shape. I guess, like I said before about, anything concave, I find, it being the mouth and all that, like, yeah, it sometimes can cause issues, and so I'm experiencing that a little bit. But here we can see the fluid, and by reversing that gravity, like lowering it, we're definitely getting a bit more of a nicer stream. And I'll do a quick preview. This isn't the entire sim, it stops around there. So let's go like to 260. But overall, it's looking good. Just as a test, this is not anything that I'm intentionally trying to do. But from this point, we'll start to get into the actual emission. But I just wanted to showcase this a little bit, just give a bit of a walkthrough. The controls are pretty basic. When you get into doing more larger scale fluids, having all the foam and secondary splashes, stuff like that, that's where things get not more complicated, but there's a process to it. And we'll definitely get into meshing, we'll get into texturing, we'll be doing a few things with this, but initially, I just want to give like a basic intro to this, and what we need to do is pretty straightforward. It's more about just getting viscous fluids and getting the shape and everything right. But yeah, so we probably won't get into motion fields or anything like that necessarily here, but I definitely will be doing some lessons on that soon. But yeah, I mean, in general, this is like a really basic emission, but you can see that we've got this all working, colliding, doing its thing, and it's all working. Now, just to mention this, like, let's just say that I wanted to add more particle points in here, just because I felt like if I were to mesh this, it'd have a lot of gaps in it, and I didn't want to have to increase the voxelation, like the voxel scale, I bring it down. I can always go into liquid, and you've got like bandwidth here, so I could say the interior and the surface parameters, so I could up that to 4 and that to 2. If I were to run this again, that would double the amount of particles being distributed through here. Now, I want to mention that this, although it is creating points, I don't want you to think of this as particles. I want you to think of it more as it's just creating more, it's subdividing, like tessellating, that's the incorrect term here, but I want you to kind of think of it that way. It's like subdividing things down and filling it out more, because essentially it's distributing just more points into the mesh. So that way, let's say if you were like a low res mesh, but you wanted to have lots of points in there to fill it out for the actual shape generation later, then that would be one way you could do it. So, I just want to kind of mention a few things like that. I'll keep all this the same for now, but let's add our mesh. Okay, so we got this guy here, which is our ABC fluids. I'm going to go into emitter. I'm going to change this. Sorry, I'm going to change my shape here to be a custom, and we'll just pick and choose the Alembic mesh, and that's going to allow us just to have our shape set up here. And beyond that, we've already set up the basic parameters of what we want. I did mention upping your interior in here. I might actually bring that up just for the sake of this, because I imagine it's going to get pretty sparse now that we're dealing with these really small shapes. So another thing is, like, the fluid emission I'm doing here, you can see all the gapping going on, so I'm going to increase increase my resolution, decrease my voxel size. So I'm just going to bring that down, and this is a global value, so if I wanted to do it specifically for any of these things, I can actually go in there and control the voxel scale. I was just doing that as a demonstration, but the voxel scale, stuff like that. Okay, so these are things that by default we had this, not at default, but we had this at 1, this at 0.5, but I just wanted to mention this as a demonstration that you can control these. So that should be 0.5 and that at 1, but you can control these on an individual basis if you want to. So in general, though, I'm going to bring my voxel size down to 0.5, and that's going to increase the resolution of everything, and we kind of need to do that because the size of these is quite small. And we also increase the bandwidth here, well, essentially the density of each of these for the distribution, so that way we'll just get more defined shapes from it as well. I'm going to run a sim of this, and let's just see how this looks, but basically all we've really done is choose this mesh now to emit from, rather than using this large radius sphere here. So let me sim to 10 frames just to get an idea if this is working, and it kind of is. I need, I think, a bit more resolution still. So going back into my solver, I'm going to just bring my master voxel down a little bit more. It might be good to look at the voxel grid just to get an idea. So that's pretty fine. I'm going to do a 0.35, but we'll go to liquid, and I'm going to up these a little bit. In fact, I'm just going to up the surface density here, so I'm going to keep that at 2. And I might specifically just adjust it in here as well. Okay, so I'm going to run this now, and yeah, should be all good. All right. And another thing we can do if this is still a little bit too fine is just make the shapes bigger. So if I just do a push modifier, I can make this like, a little bit larger, and that's just going to scale them out a little bit. So at least for now, let's do that, and then later, if we need to, we can revise it. But at least for now, it's more about just trying to figure out the size that we need that's going to fit in here to get the distribution working. Okay, so here's a preview. Already, I think this is looking really good. I think it's working quite well for what we need it to be. And yeah, so I think we can just continue to move forward. I didn't imagine we would spend too much time working on this. It's not really that complicated because we've built up that procedural workflow. A lot of the choreography is already done for it. So because of that, we don't really need to do too much more here. We've got things flowing down, we've got things interacting, things like that. It's all looking really cool. So at this point, I think overall everything's good. I didn't sim the entire thing. I needed to about 215, 220. So I need to run a final sim. But we can at least look at, I'm going to do the mesh generation later, but if we want, we could look at that as well early on. But I think overall, we're not going to use any motion fields. I'm just trying to think of anything else that I would want to add. I'm not using foam or anything like that. Yeah, I think in general all this is looking good. By the way, one thing I wanted to mention is that you do have the expansion rate and the density here. So if you want, you can plug maps in, and that way we wouldn't even need the particles, or we wouldn't need the Olympic mesh because we could just plug a map in. However, right now it doesn't appear to be working, especially the UV projections. So that's why we're going about it the way that we are. But I still think that in general, I like the approach that we've got because we're creating volume on top of it. So it really depends on what you're going after. But I figured I'd mention that typically you would be able to use maps to drive some of this stuff. Yeah, so in general, there is a lot of potential here. It's just right now, unfortunately, just the implementation. There's a few things that I'm experiencing that are breaking. But yeah, I'm sure a lot of those are going to get fixed. So that being said, we're going to get into the mesh generation, all that stuff in a minute, so I'm not too concerned about that. Just actually, I haven't really mentioned this, but you have multiple solvers up here. So if you wanted to try out different things, you can do it. You can duplicate these and run sims as much as you want. And it's kind of handy just having those variations there. So I can find that kind of handy at times. Like, I personally am not really running multiple ones. Like, I kind of know what I want. But if I want, let's say a good example would be if I wanted to have multiple machines running different viscosity tests, I could easily just duplicate these, and because they're dynamic, in other words, because they're using variables here, they're not going to override each other. So it's very easy just to spit out a bunch of versions, run the iterations, and then come back. I guess it's just I've never been someone who needs to do that excessive amount of prototyping. There is cases where I do, but I know that that was like a really big kind of show point for when the Max Fluids came out, was the fact that you can, you know, clone, and then run the sims and check out all the different versions. And personally, you know, I iterate very quickly at the very beginning, but by the time I'm ready to do any big sims, I'm already pretty confident about like how I think it's going to look. But you know, it just comes down to what situation I'm in. But in general, yeah, I just don't really do a lot of like, you know, different permutations of it. Yeah, so in here, basically, you've got like, if you want to generate your foam, which we're not doing anything of, and then your mesh generation, if you wanted to have both of them going at the same time, or just to generate the mesh, you can choose foam, mesh, and your actual fluid sim here. But right now, we're just working on fluids. Delete your caches, you know, yeah, all this kind of stuff. So motion fields are essentially a way to kind of pipe in velocity fields. It's kind of interesting, but again, outside of our spectrum of what we're doing right now. Going back to solvers, just I'm going to quickly touch on a few things. Containers are if you wanted to have like a one emission of a volume, so that way, let's say if you want to fill a pool really quickly, things like that, then you're able to do that pretty quickly. And yeah, so then additional velocities, if you wanted to have like an initial advection, like let's say a splash shooting upwards, something like that, you can do that. And you can have a helper if you want to get a bit more specific with the directionality, you can plug all that in. But yeah, you know, again, I'm just kind of pointing out a few of the no-brainers. In general though, you know, what we've got is all good, like I said. So I'm going to do another cache. I feel like resolution, everything is pretty good. I don't want this to be like, I don't want to overcomplicate it. I know for me personally, at this point I would probably up-res it and be like, all right, I'll add more detail, but I don't think it's really necessary for what we're doing. I'm trying really hard with this lesson not to make it like a really long, lengthy sim. Like the Fireball training that I put out a few months ago, that was something where you might wait days for a sim, and I want this to be, you know, an hour at the hour and a half at the most for the liquid sim, and then we'll get on to everything else. So yeah, we'll get into display, render settings, all that stuff next. So yeah, let's just finish our sim. I didn't really change anything, so I might just, you know, resume where I was at. Okay, so I've ran the simulation and I've generated a preview here. So this is looking really cool. There's a few little splatters that happen, and as I mentioned, that's going to happen. So just be aware of that. But there's two there, which I'm not a huge fan of, just on the side. Yeah, but honestly, we can kill them. It's not that big a deal. Whereas the other splatters, I think, are really effective. I also kept my Alembic on, just so that way we can kind of see all those spheres popping up. I think it'll be interesting to have that there as well. So, as we can see on top of the face, we also have these here too. And so we have the fluid being generated. That's looking really cool. The next step is to look at surfacing all of this, okay? And as we get into that, we might as well get into rendering as well. So that's going to be one of the last steps, is just going through the lighting, the rendering, and getting all the mesh stuff set up as well. But for the time being, let's start to dive into this a little bit. I'm just going to go to the beginning. And one thing, I'm not a big fan of how currently this stuff works in terms of the surfacing, just having to generate. I'd love some kind of real-time options in here, but anyway, so let's just turn off the liquid component, so that way we're not generating anything else. We'll turn on the mesh component. We'll go display. We'll change this to Bifrost Cache Mesh. Okay, and right now it disappears because nothing is set up. And this is just a preset if we had something that we really liked. So for the time being, and it's fairly fast, I'm just going to hit Start Solve. Now, technically you could be generating this while you're doing the simulation. It will slow it down, but I'd rather get the simulation done and then go back and look at this. So let's go to one of the earlier frames. I will hide the alembic for now, just so that's out of the way. And here we can see the surfacing. So I'm going to turn that off, and you're going to see me go back and forth a lot. But there's the basic surfacing. It's only done a few frames, but you get the idea. We've also got options like you could use frost or something like that too, but the options in here aren't bad. Okay, you've got a few different things in here, mainly droplet radius, and then we got surfacing, and it's more to do with you got the actual radius, but then how much it's going to want to kind of adapt to the other particle points around it. So just by lowering the radius, we'll hit restart. And now just doing a couple frames, you can see that we're getting it a lot thinner. However, I won't be able to go like much lower without playing with the other settings a little bit. So I want these to be pretty tight, so probably like 0.2. But there's going to be a certain point where we need to start playing with the surfacing as well as adding more detail too. So I'm just going to raise the resolution factor slightly, restart. And then if we lower our surface radius, we're starting to get those individual particles by doing that. So basically physical radius and then more how much is going to reach out. And then also here allows us to get more definition. So I'm just going to throw in something like bring the droplet factor up to 6 and bring the surface radius down a little bit so it'll essentially respect everything around it, but it won't. You won't get like a very smooth big mesh. I'm trying to get those individual droplets. My radius is a lot smaller, so again, it's just really tight, and it will connect with everything around it, but it's just not going to become a big, smooth, clunky mesh. Resolution factor I'm upping just to get more detail. Smoothing, same deal. And yeah, so just in general, is this something that's going to give us a tighter mesh? And beyond that, I'd say render settings, let's just output whatever we want. I'm going to output the UVs. We have velocity. Unfortunately, I don't think V-Ray supports it yet. Arnold does, so we've got options. But yeah, there's... I'm just going to output some different stuff here, but I mean, for the most part, you know, we're not really going to use this stuff, but it's interesting to have it just in case we want to get through it later on. So curvature is the other one that I thought might be interesting to talk about. Okay, cool. And then we have render as a cache mesh. And yeah, so anyway, I'm going to spit this out really quick, and then we can take a look at the mesh generation for this. Okay, so here is the preview. Everything's looking really cool. I like how that's turned out. Again, I think that the fact that we have it so small, it becomes really defined, and that's what I want. I don't want this to be this big gunky thing, but rather something that it feels like it's seeping out of the pores. Now, one thing you might be able to see in there is I've got the alembic mesher in there as well, and I did that on purpose because I like the idea of like having little pores popping up everywhere, and I didn't want to mention it earlier on too much, but that's something that I'm hoping would blend together really well. And we're going to go through another step, like another round of just doing some stuff to that next. And yeah, but overall, this is looking really cool. I like how this has turned out. So the final thing that I'm going to do, I'm going to go and hide my liquid, and let's jump on this really quick. So now that we have this as an emission and it's working really well, I'm going to right click and clone this, and instead of fluids emission, I'm going to call this fluid pores, and we'll hide the Alembic emission and we'll drag this one into characters for now. Character render. And we'll hide everything else. Let's just focus on this for a second. So what I want to do is I'm going to go into my shader editor really quick. And we have all these maps located around here. So what was it? I want to get the cellular. So let me just try and find where the heck it is. So here we go. Okay, so sorry, V-Ray distance texture. I'm going to get a cellular map from there. I want to go into a new V-Ray material. For now, let's just paste as a copy on that and then drop it into here. Now, the only thing I'm not 100% sure of is how well the mapping, like that's one thing we didn't do is lock the mapping on this. I'm hoping it still has some kind of mapping and it's not too weird. So I'm just going to render out a frame of this. I just want to see how it looks. And I'm going to keep in mind that like we're not really going to get to see it much, but I still want to just test to see like the scale of it and whether it's mapping correctly. So I have a feeling it doesn't have any mapping, which kind of sucks if that is the case. Just for a moment, I'm going to just set the RGB amount much higher. Yeah, we don't have any mapping on here, so this sucks. Okay, that's totally fine. So that was one thing I should have done in the pflow, was put mapping into there, but it's still fine. There's a few workarounds for it. One is we could use object, which I'm not a huge fan of, just because the mapping won't adapt properly. The other thing that I could try to do is do face mapping, but yeah, it's not gonna work. So I'm just thinking out loud. I'm going to set this to about size 1 or 0.3. Let's try. I'm gonna lower my RGB amount. We'll definitely lower that right back down to 1 in a moment. I'm just trying to get the mapping somewhat set up. Oh, sorry. Object XYZ. I should have been on that. So I'm going to try setting that back to like 2. Okay, so that's good. I'm going to try setting 0.8. Alright, and so I'm going to do about 0.45. And what I'll do is I'm going to put a V-Ray displacement modifier on here. And we'll do 3D mapping, and we'll drop that cellular in as a map. Set instance, set this to like 0.3, not too high, and I'm going to invert the colors. So let's see what that gives us. All I'm looking to do is just get these simple spheres and make them into something that actually is kind of gunky and gross. So I'm going to play with the spread a little bit, and we'll go back up. I'm now going to turn the diffuse map off because I basically just wanted to visualize it while I got the scale right. And I'm going to apply this to the mapping here. Okay, so now we're getting something kind of weird and gunky. I'll switch to the camera view. And yeah, this just gives us something interesting. Now, I'll try to render region, and I'm just going to draw a section, and then we'll turn the V-Ray displacement off. I just want to see how much it's ballooning up. Okay, it's not at all. That's great. So, turning this back on, yeah, we just got this kind of weirdness, like, you know, weird displacement on here, which is working out great. So, going back to our shader here, which is like the hand or the face, any of them, I'm just going to drop the infection shader by itself onto these pores here. And it's just going to give us, you know, something kind of interesting. Turn render region off. And obviously that relies pretty heavily on the blending and all that kind of stuff. So next lesson we're going to get into the lighting, the shading, the rendering, the comp, all that good stuff, and we're going to do a lot with that. So for now, I'm not too concerned about this. You know, I'm happy having it just gray. It doesn't really matter too much because, like I said, it's more the liquid, which I'll assign, and if we were to get the character collision upper body, and I'll just assign that as well. So right now everything's going to look gray, but the next step is we're going to start to work on the lighting, the shading, and get all this stuff set up so we got all the blending, the displacement, everything looking really cool. Okay, so I'll make this quick. I hope you enjoyed that. Like I said, next video we're going to be doing all the rendering, the lighting, and everything else. In the meantime, I've got a lot of email I'm still catching up on, so if I haven't replied to your email yet, I will. I definitely am putting aside time at the moment over my holidays to make sure that I respond to everyone and try and answer questions and give as much feedback as I can. There's a few special things that I've got organized I want to do for you as well, so expect a few additional bonuses and other cool things as we go through this. Okay, keep an eye out on your inbox. I'll be sending the next video very shortly.